Office has announced that it is no longer working with the main provider of migrant hotels over its alleged poor behaviour and poor performance.
While Stay Belvedere Hotels provides a quarter of accommodation for asylum seekers, it's being replaced by the company behind the Bibby Stockholm barge.
Yes, curious. We're joined now by our political correspondent, Catherine Forster. Catherine, thank you very much. I believe you're with the Shadow Home Secretary.
Yes, I am indeed. Good afternoon from College Green. The Shadow Home Secretary, Chris Philp, was speaking in the House of Commons a little bit earlier and joins us now. Thank you very much for talking to us today on GB News. This government, you said you'd stop the boats, you didn't. This government said they'd smash the gangs. They didn't. What do you make of the figures where we are now? We've had nearly 6,000 people make that crossing this year alone.
Yeah, well, the last government in 2023 did start to get the numbers crossing the Channel down. But what's happened since the election is the numbers have gone into reverse. They've started going back up. They're up by 31% since the general election. Nearly 30,000 people have illegally crossed the English Channel. And as you say, this year alone, just in the last few weeks, 6,000 people have illegally crossed the Channel. That is the worst start to any year in history. It's the worst year ever. So the Labour government's claims to be smashing the gangs are in complete tatters.
They would say that they are processing people more quickly, that they're returning people out of the country. Do you give them any credit for that at all?
Not really. Most of their returns are voluntary to Eastern European countries. Only a tiny, tiny fraction of the number of people they are returning actually arrived here by small boat. And in fact, that number has gone down since the election, not up. And the number of people they're returning who arrived on small boats, it amounts to about 4% of crossings. They're letting 96% of these illegal immigrants crossing the Channel stay here in this country. And let's be clear, they are illegal immigrants. They're entering the UK illegally. And they're not fleeing war because there is no war in France. France is a perfectly safe country. France has a well-functioning asylum system. Nobody needs to get into a rubber dinghy and go from France to the UK to flee a war. If people want to seek protection, they're perfectly able to claim asylum in France or indeed in Belgium or Germany or any of the other countries they may have passed through previously. There is no excuse for getting into a dinghy and crossing the Channel. And that's why the Rwanda deterrent that the last government was ready to start was so important. That would have seen everybody crossing the Channel by dinghy get sent to Rwanda, and it's quite clear that very quickly the deterrent effect of that would have stopped people trying to cross in the first place, but Labour cancelled that scheme before it started. The first flight was due to take off on July the 24th.
On the topic of the grooming gangs, the Conservatives tabling an amendment to the Crime and Policing Bill to force a national statutory inquiry. You're not going to win that vote. What's this about? Is this some sort of political stunt?
No, it's not. We think it's vital there is a national statutory public inquiry into the rape gangs because lots of public officials, councillors, the police, the Crown Prosecution Service and others covered this up for many, many years and deliberately ignored the testimony of victims. And I want to see the public officials who covered this up, or at the very least ignored what the victims were saying, held to account. There's a criminal offence called misconduct in public office, and I think any public official, including local councillors and councils, who turned a blind eye to these rape gangs because they were of predominantly Pakistani heritage, they should be held to account. They should frankly be prosecuted. They should go to prison. Now, Labour's proposal to have just 5 local inquiries simply is not good enough. Firstly, about 50 towns were affected, not 45. Some towns, like Oldham, are refusing to have an inquiry. So that's the first problem with Labour's approach, only 5 towns covered. But secondly, these local inquiries don't have statutory powers, which means they don't have the legal ability to force witnesses to appear, to requisition evidence, to take evidence under oath. And one of these local inquiries in Manchester last year saw the chairs resign because even as recently as last year, public bodies were still refusing to provide evidence. That's why it's got to be a national statutory inquiry. We're going to put it to a vote after Easter in Parliament, and we'll find out whose side Labour is really on.
Thank you, Chris Philp, for talking to us. Of course, the Conservatives were in office for 14 years. You would wonder why, if this is so important, they didn't do it then. But that is the Shadow Home Secretary. Back to you in the studio.
Thanks very much indeed, Catherine Forster. We learnt quite a bit there. Timing for when this may indeed happen, when this amendment will be laid. It will be fascinating to see how the government respond.
It will indeed. It'll put Labour in a bit of a tricky position. But we're going to turn now to Mark White, to the source of this issue, or at least one of the sources, the travel passage, at least. Mark, you're in Dover. You've been watching the boats continue to come over. I think 3 the last time we spoke. The 3rd was struggling, but 2 had been successful, bringing well over 100 new migrants. They, of course, will need to be housed somewhere, Mark.
Yeah, that 3rd boat, to bring you right up to speed, did struggle with engine issues, and it has returned to France. So 2 boats today, just 2 boats, I say, but still 128 migrants who've made it to the UK. And the day's not over. The winds are actually calming down in the Channel, so perfectly possible that we'll get some evening sort of push-offs from the beaches in France. But even with the 128 who've crossed today, our calculations take the total number who have arrived since Labour came into power to 29,997, just 3 shy of 30,000 that Chris Philp mentioned there to Catherine. Just 3 shy of that 30,000 mark. So effectively, we are at 30,000 small boat migrants who've crossed the English Channel since Labour came to power. An illustration, a stark and grim illustration, that the small boat crisis, far from being resolved or slowed in any capacity, is actually as bad as it's ever been, worse than it has been for some considerable time, because the figures are 40% up on where we were at the same point last year. At this point last year, 4,300 migrants had crossed the English Channel. Today, 6,048 have now crossed the Channel this year. So it gives you an indication of just how big a problem this is for Sir Keir Starmer to solve. He wants to do it by a law enforcement approach alone, to go after the criminal gangs and dismantle them. But 9 months in to this Labour government, it's clear that that approach just isn't paying off.
Almost 30,000. If every single one of those individuals is put into a hotel room, we know that costs on average £145 per night. 145 times 30,000 is £4,350,000 each and every day, just for those new arrivals who've come since the government got in. That's £4.5 million a day.
What you're paying your taxes for, Tom?
On hotels alone.
Yep.
That's not even getting into the stipends and the rest of it. Mark White, I would thank you, but frankly, I'm a little annoyed now. But Mark White, thanks indeed for joining us live from Dover.
Well, first it was Rishi Sunak, like King Canute, couldn't stop the tide. Now it's Sir Keir Starmer's turn. Well, joining the studio to continue this conversation now with the former Immigration Minister for the Conservative Party, Kevin Foster. Kevin, welcome to the show. Smash the gangs was the phrase that the Labour Party came up with. The gangs aren't listening. 3 shy of 30,000 since the Labour Party were elected. A record, to be fair, which even surpassed your own.
Yeah, well, smash the gangs was a slogan, not a strategy for government. It was just something to be repeated ad nauseum during an election campaign to make up for not actually having a clear plan. And when they came into office, scrap Rwanda, scrap plans for large accommodation centres, which would help process people and get them potentially out the country, scrap the barge, and basically focus purely on the law enforcement angle. Now, prosecuting gangs involved in this is, of course, a thing to do, but it's not the only thing you need to do. And we're now seeing numbers going up. We're at this time of the year to see record numbers is concerning because they think winter weather makes it harder to cross in a flimsy boat. Of course, we're now coming into the spring and summer where we'll see better weather, calmer seas, and we could easily see this be a record year. We already had at the end of the year 38,000 people in hotels. By the summer, that could be 50 or even 60,000.
Still hasn't surpassed the record, though, which did come under the Conservative government a couple of years ago. And it's easy, is it not, in opposition to throw mud pies. The Labour Party tried that, and now they're in power. They're finding it very, very difficult to govern. How do we get out of this mess? We haven't managed thus far to get a single flight off the ground, enforced flight of deportation to Rwanda. We're not getting anybody out of the country. People stay in the country over chicken nuggets, marrying people who are dead, joining prescribed terrorist groups, suddenly becoming gay or Christian. The law is against it. The system is against it. Successive governments haven't got anywhere. What on earth can we do, Kevin?
Well, I think you're right, Martin. There's plenty of challenges in this area, and just using a slogan, and to be fair, stop the boats just as a slogan would be as effective as just saying stop the boats, the same as smash the gangs. So for me, what you need is to look at countries like Greece, look at Australia that has managed to effectively deal with this type of problem. And they didn't just have one approach. They had multiple. So they reformed their law. They dealt with the appeals process. They had a third country agreement, particularly in Australia, to deal with the core question with some, which is, OK, you can't return them to France, but they're also, let's say, from a country like Syria, where you can't realistically decide which jihadist group you'd like to deal with to return people. So what do you do with them? That then means a third country deal.
Like Rwanda, but that didn't work.
Well, Rwanda could have worked. There's no two ways about it. I think probably Robert Jenrick is absolutely right in saying that we may
could have been an astronaut.
Well, you can, so could anyone. Well, there's certainly things for me is that you could make that work. And Australia made their third country deal work. We could do with ourselves. I think there will need to be a view taken on the ECHR quite clearly, particularly its application in some of these cases where we're seeing flagrant abuse and rights that were meant to stop what the Nazis did to communities they were persecuting being used for ludicrous examples like chicken nugget preferences, or authorities might question me when I get back about the criminal record I acquired in the UK. So there is a way to get through this. I must say, it'd be a lot easier if we could work proactively with a French government also equally committed to ending this problem.
Kevin, we saw pictures on our screens there of illegal immigrants literally up to their knees in water. I've had deeper baths than that.
Absolutely.
The French stood by and watched. We give them £500 million a year. All they seem to do is stand around and smoke gitans. Nothing's happening. That's a waste of money. The French aren't going to solve this. Why would they? They don't want them to stay. They don't want the illegals to stay in their country. They want them gone.
Well, the reason why France should want to tackle this is the lawlessness in the Pas de Calais that impacts on French citizens. These gangs don't just engage in people smuggling. They engage in the whole panoply of criminal behaviour. And it actually makes the Pas de Calais quite a dangerous place to be at times. So there is an incentive there, perhaps for a future French president, not Emmanuel Macron, given his own record, but a future French president, to work with the UK and actually dealing with this problem. And, of course, other European countries who similarly it's in their interest to deal with. 14
years you had to do all of the above, and let's face it, that didn't happen. What could possibly be different in the future, and why should voters trust the Conservative Party after, let's face it, 14 years of failing?
Well, first, let's remember we had the Liberal Democrats with us for the first 5 years who aren't known for their tough immigration policies, it's safe to say. But what we need to do...
But it was in those manifesto pledges of those election years to bring immigration down. You can't blame Nick Clegg.
No, I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying, Martin. What we need to do is actually look across the Atlantic where, prior to an election, Donald Trump and his team thought through how are we going to tackle this issue? Everything from the US military, taking deportation flights to avoid the issues of trying to get charters, working with third countries. We look at the deal they've done with El Salvador around removing criminals from US jails into El Salvador.
But that requires a Donald Trump figure. Who is our Trump? It requires somebody who won't give a monkeys about the backlash, won't care about the lawyers, and isn't a member of the European Court of Human Rights. And we're all of the above. And, people just listen to this, Kevin, and think we've heard all of this before. What's going to be different?
Well, that's where, Martin, it'll need to be, as we go into the next general election, we'll need to have not just a pledge, a plan. Actually, there's nothing to stop us drafting up legislation in exactly the way the US administration did before it took office. Say, right, this is what, if next Thursday, for sake of argument, you vote for the Conservative Party, that's what goes into Parliament. Every candidate signed up to deliver it, and if you don't want to do it, then you don't stand as a Conservative candidate.
Kevin, why do we have to go so far afield to have containment centres? Albania have got to deal with the Italians, Rwanda failed. What about the Shetland Islands? What about Scotland?
Well, you could certainly look at potentially doing accommodation centres within the UK. I must say they would have to look at changing the planning rules. One of the many things on my list of frustration around our planning system is, for example, in things like immigration facilities, which is a UK-wide issue, actually it's devolved planning, and you can imagine how helpful the SNP were on that.
So the
subject.
The SNP could stop the government in power in Westminster from dealing with a UK-wide immigration issue by refusing planning permission of containment centres in Scotland?
Well, when the devolution deals were done, and the original devolution back in 1999,
that's bonkers.
Planning was. I agree, and it's certainly something that, as part of a plan, we do. And also, in particular, Martin, I used to have the joy at times of dealing with SNP councils calling on us to be more welcoming to asylum seekers, yet did not want to sign up to this system for accommodating asylum seekers.
Funny,
always an interesting contrast. So, for me, it is a part of that broad plan. How do we go out there and say to people, and, people from Reform as well, will need to do the same. At the moment, people can give sound bites, but when we get to that next election, people will need to have plans that are credible and can be delivered, and voters will punish them if they don't.
Kevin Foster, always a pleasure to have your company and your presence here in Westminster in the studio. Thank you very much for joining us today on GB News.